Welcome to Something Great. Today we have John hosting with me
Hello.
and Jim Zamzow, who is an amazing Idaho institution. Everyone knows who he is. Can you say hi, Jim?
Hello.
And we're going to start with our icebreaker questions today. These are just our silly questions for making everyone feel at ease in the room. So I'll ask the first one. What book has had the greatest impact on your life?
Probably an eco-agricultural primer by C.J. Zamzow and Charlie Walters. They started Acres USA, which is it's an organic-based farming magazine and organization.
Very cool.
Our next question is, if you were given 2 free hours during the day, what would you do with those hours?
I would be in the lab and I would be fermenting something probably.
Okay.
That's kind of the direction I'm headed right now is studying fermentation and how we can beneficially affect the soil and the gut of mammals and animals.
You're doing lots of really amazing work in that area too.
Well, the more you do, the more you learn, and the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. So you just keep going down one trail and then another.
Our next question comes from our staff here, and they said, who would win in a fight? 100 duck-sized horses or one horse-sized duck?
Well, there's an old saying that it's not the size of the dog in the fight, but it's the size of the fight in the dog.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that would just depend on which one of them had the most fight. Now, if you were talking about something besides ducks, because I've raised ducks before, they're not very good fighters.
What's your favorite snack food?
Probably Lay's barbecue potato chips.
Good choice. What personality trait has gotten you in the most trouble?
Probably the comedian part of me. I think a lot of things are funny that most people don't. So I get kind of on the raw edge sometimes with my humor. I have to ask permission before I tell a joke.
Go ahead and say it. We can always edit it out if we need to.
There you go.
It's always fun getting to know people, but you have so much knowledge, and we're really excited just to kind of dive into the meat part of this. So you and your stores, and there's quite a few stores that you have here in the Valley now, are a really integral part of the Treasure Valley. You built this massive community and a culture that's really unique to Zamzow. And now you've released a book it's been pretty recently, called, and I have it right here, That Reminds Me of a Story, and it's absolutely worth reading. Can you talk to me about how storytelling has helped you with your business?
Jesus taught by telling parables, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I've just learned that people want to hear what you have to say if you tell it in a story. My mother's side of the family came from East Tennessee, so they were hillbillies really, and they passed on their legacy through telling stories. So Mom would sit down and have lunch with we 3 kids, and she would tell us stories about Tennessee. And then, boy, was I surprised when I took my grandmother back there when she was 96 to find out that all these stories were true. I thought they were just all stories. So I think it just kind of runs in our family. My dad has always told stories, and Mom always did, and of course our grandparents did as well. So if we kids were interested in our history at all, which I was, then they would tell the stories. So I kind of learned how to tell stories. And the way this book came about, we had hired Art Gregory to be our communications director, and he would write ads for me to record, and then while we sat there, we should have taken a half an hour to record a 30-second spot, but it would take about 2 hours to do it because I would be telling him stories. Well, unbeknownst to him, or to me, pardon me, he was recording, I guess just memorizing them in his head, but every time I would tell a story, he would kind of jot it down. Mm-hmm. When he went back to school to get his master's degree in communication, he wrote all of those stories as his thesis.
Wow.
So when he brought that back, I said, Art, I can't believe you recorded all these stories. And he said, yep, I try to remember every one you tell me. And then, of course, Dad told him, and my brother Rick told him, and he knew Grandma, and she told stories. So he basically recorded all those stories. And I said, Art, we've got to publish that. And the reason we've got to publish it is for my heirs, for my grandkids, because this is a good way for us to do that for them. Mm-hmm. I don't really care if we ever sell any of these books. That's not the purpose behind it. The purpose was to get the information in print, which we did. Mm-hmm. And, Art did a great job of collecting the stories. I had to read the thing 4 or 5 times along with my wife and edit it, to try to clean it up as much as we possibly could. And I took out some stuff that I didn't think that was very readable, stuff that shouldn't be read. Be careful what you write down, right?
Well, and I grew up in the valley as well, and I remember hearing a lot of these radio spots that you used a lot of stories in your marketing. And so I remember hopping in the truck with my dad and getting the dog in the front seat, and we'd head down and bring the cows to the auction over in Nampa, and those spots would come on, and that's kind of a nostalgic part of my childhood as well.
Yeah.
Is I remember listening to those stories and going down to the local Zamzows and picking up a lot of different products for our animals that we had. So
I noticed that you pronounce our name Zamzows and you pronounce our name Zamzows.
Oh, am I doing it wrong?
Well, there's really no wrong. The proper way is Zamzows. Okay. That's why we say we did the rhyming ad. Nobody knows like Zamzows. Okay. We figured that would help with that. But I had a lady call me here a while back, and she said, I want to tell you this funny story about my 4-year-old. And I said, okay. And she said, well, we got in the car, and I said, honey, what do you want to do? And she said, I want to go to Sam's house. She said, you want to go to Sam's house? Yes. She said, I, for the life of me, couldn't figure out. So we were out driving around, and she was very upset because I wasn't going to Sam's house. And she said, we happened to drive by one of your stores, and she said, there, Sam's house. So she wanted to go in and see the animals in the pet shop, right? So Sam's house, Zamzows, But we asked Grandma one time, we said, Grandma, what's the proper way? How did you do that? In the old country, they were Prussian.
Okay.
And how in the old country did they pronounce it? And she said, well, honey, she always called me honey, it depends on whether you were from the east or the west. Mm-hmm. If you were from the east part of the country, it was pronounced one way. I think it was Zamzow if you were Eastern Prussia, and Zamzow if you were Western.
Okay.
So even German and Polish people that see it, they'll pronounce it differently.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to know that I wasn't saying it the right, Zamzow. Thank you.
Well, there's a few stories that you highlighted in your book that I really found helpful, and I'd love for you to tell a couple of those stories. Let's start with the first one. You had a story about a man who you were bringing coal to him, and he didn't want to pay for his coal. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Well, he didn't want to pay for it, but he told me that he did. Before I left, and I was a teenager at the time, and before I left the coal yard, Ed Havard, who was my boss, he said, do not unload this coal until you've gotten the check, because if you do, you're not going to get the money. And so I was well advised. So I pulled up. I had a 2-ton of coal on the pickup, and I pulled up to the coal bin, and I went to the front door, knocked on the door. He came out, and he said, you know where to put it? And I said, yes. And he said, well, you go ahead and get started, and I'll make you a check and bring it out. And I said, okay. I figured that was close enough. So I opened the coal bin, I put my tarps down, and I shoveled in 2 tons of coal into this bin. Got it all cleaned up, because we were taught, always leave it cleaner than what you find it. So never left a piece of coal, Got that all done, got my truck all, and then my shovel all put away, went to the front door. No, he wouldn't come to the door. Went to the back door, he wouldn't come to the door. And I knew he was in there, because nobody had left. He absolutely would not come. And I remembered, oh boy, I better not go back without that check or the coal. So, because my brother and I hauled coal all over this town, there's very, very few houses or buildings that we couldn't get into. Because if you can get into the coal chute, you can get into the house or the business. Which reminds me of another story that's probably not a very good one, but anyway. So I opened the coal bin back up, put my tarp down, got in the coal bin, shoveled. I'd shovel about 500 pounds out through the window onto the tarp, get back out, shovel it back into my pickup, and I did that until I had all 2 ton of it back in the pickup. Got everything all cleaned back up and left. And then when I got back, the guy called and said, "Hey, Ed, bring my coal back." And Art said, "Jim, all right, he's there. He said he'll give you the check." And I said, "Art, I will never deliver coal to that house again." So I said, if he wants coal, he can either come get it or you can deliver it yourself, because I'm not taking it.
And in today's world, I think that's kind of a unique story, because we have, the common saying of the customer's always right. And, that was an interesting example to me of, well, we need to make sure that we're honest in what we're doing, and that goes both ways.
Well, you basically have a contract in business. I will provide my product or service, and you in turn provide the money. I always wondered, wherever did it happen that we decided that we would provide our product or service, and I'd have to wait 30 days before you paid me. That's not how it originally was. When I grew up in the store at Fairview Avenue, when people came in, you give them a sack of dairy feed, and they gave you the $3.95 is what it cost at the time, and everybody went away. Now, if they were on tough times and they needed feed for their cows, which is mostly what we fed it back in those days, they'd say, "I'm short, can I pay you next week?" And our accounting system was a little piece of block of wood with a nail sticking up through it, and we would just take the receipt, have them sign it, and we'd just stick it on the nail. And all through the 60s, we had a whole nail full of, and people would come in when they'd get their milk check, or when they would sell a beef, they would come in then and pay their bill. We didn't have an accounting system at that time, and we had counter checks. We had a check for every bank. People could come in and say, "I need a counter check for First Security." We'd just tear one off the book and give it to them, and they'd just write out a check and put their names and stuff on it. And back in those days, the bankers knew all the people anyway, So, but in the early 70s, that started to change. People quit coming in to pay for their signed slip that was on the nail. And so then, 30 days, and we had to start then going out to collect them, and the fun kind of went away then. Because people started realizing, I can get my product, but I really don't have to pay for it. I can get away from it. And if they didn't pay for it. So we had to start an accounting system. We had to start having people fill out applications and sign that they promised to pay by the 10th of the month and all that kind of stuff. But until 1970, we didn't have that. So things changed. And now they've changed a lot since then, too.
Yeah. Another great story that I loved in the book was when you were talking with the former mayor of Kuna. I think his name was Dwayne Yamamoto.
Yep.
And you had approached him with an idea. Can you share a little bit about what that was?
Well, I was in my 20s. I was working at the Kuna store, which was a one-man operation at the time, and Dwayne was the mayor of Kuna, and was a multi-generational Japanese farmer, very good farmers. He lived in the house right next to the Kuna store, and he would come in every once in a while and get calf feed. And one day he came in to get some calf feed, and he said, "Well, Jim, I'm going to open up a section of ground out here south of Kuna, out in the desert." And, of course, I was just learning in my 20s, and I was learning on a small scale about compost in the garden and stuff like that. So I make this naive comment to a man that is raised on a big farm, and I said, "Well, Dwayne, there's not any humus in that soil out there, and that what you need to do is put on about 20 ton of good compost on that ground." And he looked at me and he said, "That's a good idea, Jim." he said, do some work for me though, will you? Because I don't have time. Would you figure out how much compost I need for a section of ground, which is 640 acres at 20 ton? And he said, if you can get that delivered out there and we can get it spread for as cheap as Jack Simplot can sell me his fertilizer, he said, I'll do it. So I went to work. Rich Hormachia and Jimmy Warren were the two biggest feedlot guys, and I learned real quickly they didn't compost. All they had was just raw, stinky, anaerobic manure, and they were glad to give it to us. And when I talked to both of them, sure, we'll even load you, but you bring the trucks out, we'll load you. By the time I figured out what it took to haul that stuff out south of Cuna and get manure spreaders to put it on, and realize this is raw manure, not compost anyway, which is what I was recommending, that it wasn't even economically feasible. Well, Dwayne came in a while later, and he said, what did you find out? Which he knew all the time. I said, well, I think, I can't even find enough to put on that much ground, let alone do it economically. He said, yeah, I know. But he said, pretty good exercise, huh? And I said, yeah. He said, but I'll tell you something, Jim. If you can ever figure out how to do for the soil what that manure at 20 ton to the acre would do, you'll really have something. Well, I never forgot that. And that's where the Thrive product that we currently sell came from. It was always having that in my mind and always researching. And then, of course, when the student is ready, the master appears. So I had a lot of good mentors that showed up for me, that taught me really that what I was missing was carbon, that I needed to go back and figure out how to get carbon in the soil to counterbalance all this high nitrogen that they're putting on. Because the soil mandates, the bacteria in the soil mandate that there's a balance of nitrogen to carbon. And a perfect balance is somewhere between 12 and 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So when we go out and we put on nitrogen on the lawn, as most commercial lawn services do, or most of our commercial bagged fertilizers do, are primarily nitrogen, every pound of nitrogen they put on the soil, they burn out 12 to 20 pounds of carbon, which is the humus in the soil. After about 3 or 4 years, your soil starts turning white, insects and disease come in, your turf gets thin, weeds come up, so you got to use rescue chemistry. You got to use bug killers, and you got to use weed killers, and you got to use fungicides, because you've created your own problem by throwing the soil out of balance through the overuse of fertilization. I have spent the major part of my adult life trying to figure out how to commercially balance the soil, be able to build a business around it, but still offer a product that does not harm the soil but makes it better. And so that's how we ended up with the lawn program the way we did. There's an interesting story that goes along with that too, because you don't just develop a single product by deciding I'm going to develop a lawn fertilizer. It takes a lifetime of input from people all around you. But this interesting story was, I decided that I was going to go up to Sunnyside, Washington, and I was going to teach all of those fruit growers up there, primarily apple growers, that they didn't have to haul that apple pumice to the dump, that they were hauling thousands of tons of it to the dump. And I thought, if I can teach them how to compost that apple pumice, which is anything that if they juice it or whatever, and all that's what's left over, they can figure, if I can teach them how to compost that and then put it back on their orchards, we would be sparing the landfills, and we'd be helping their soil, actually. Well, as is always the case when you're young, the farmer knows more than you do. So here I am, probably early 30s by this time, teaching this class, and most of them in there were yawning and couldn't wait to get out of there to go to lunch, except for one guy, a decades my senior. But he came to me and he said, young man, you have a pretty good idea there. He said, I have a little dairy and I have a little orchard. And he said, I would never feed my trees anything I wouldn't feed my cows. Well, Dad at the time was the biggest dairy feed manufacturer in southern Idaho. And I thought, what is it about dairy feed that would be good to feed to apple trees? So that got me on to finding out what's in dairy feed. And of course, all the soil is like the paunch of a cow. You know, the first multi-stomached animal, they've got a fermentation chamber. And then they chew their cud, of course, and then it goes into the second stomach and so on. Well, the soil is just like that fermentation chamber we call the paunch in a cow. So the soil and the stomach are very, very similar. So I realized, oh, well, if I can feed this to a cow, I can feed it to the soil. So this guy got, so I started doing experiments on. There was a soccer field. We lived on Northview at the time, and there was a soccer field down the road, and I had already ruined all of my lawn with tests. I mean, I didn't have any place that didn't have any tests on it. So I went down to the soccer field at night, and then my new invention, whatever it happened to be at the time, I would put it in a spreader and run a strip of it out across the soccer field and then write on the sidewalk what it was that I did. And so I got all the commercial fertilizers that were available once I had finished developing this. Every commercial fertilizer that I could buy. And I put it on according to instructions and then put ours on according to instructions that I had developed. And ours beat them all, from color of green to health of the soil to health of the plant to everything. So that's when I knew that I had it. So then we started just manufacturing it in our feed mill as a commercial product. And basically, it was cow feed that I had adjusted for the soil, So that's how that all came about. Yeah. So that ends up being the foundation of our lawn program.
Which is, we use the program. But I'm curious if you went back to the soccer field and treated the whole soccer field then with your stuff, or if there was just forever lines where you could see what was.
Well, I left them confused for a while, but there was a couple of seasons there but also I wanted to, I drove by it every day, so I wanted to see how long it would last, and ours lasted the longest too. The other ones would fade away. Ours required less water to stay green because they weren't all that good with watering it anyway,
Sure. Yeah.
And I don't suppose I caused any trouble for them, but my wife is always saying, "You're going to get arrested."
That would be a sight to see the police come to your house and say, "We heard that you have been fertilizing the local soccer field."
Yeah, I hope that's not the worst crime I ever committed. Or wasn't very adventuresome, was I?
That was a great story. I love the kind of the entrepreneurial spirit of that, of being able to be like, okay, let's try this out. And that's kind of the tough thing in business is there's so many different ways to do something, and you have to find the way that works for you and that works for your customers. One of the things, the last story I wanted to talk about in this segment was you talk about the baker's dozen concept in your book and about that applying to customer service. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, my grandmother always believed in baker's dozen. She always put more in the bag than what the customer was paying for. And Dad always told me when I was young, he said, now, if you want to get a job, when you go to work, always do more work than what you're being paid for. Go 15 minutes early and start to work and stay there 15 minutes later. And he said, if you're having trouble getting a job, go to the person that you would want to hire you and tell them that you'll work for them for free for a week. And if they don't like what you do, that you don't hire me. But if you do like me and you hire me, then pay me for that week. And he said, Jim, you're a good worker, and so it doesn't matter where you go. I mean, if you do what you're told and you do a good job, you'll get the job. That's kind of where the concept comes from, I think. It's always do more. And besides that, it always comes back to you. When you're generous with people, it always comes back to you.
It's true. I think this has been really fun. We're going to pause for a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back.